You people always want more, don't you?
The flight attendant's words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, slicing through the quiet hum of the cabin. Marcus Bennett blinked, his calm demeanor betraying nothing, but the sting of her tone was undeniable. He had only asked for a glass of water, a simple, polite request. Yet, the look in her eyes and the venom in her voice carried more than annoyance. They carried judgment.
"Excuse me,"
Marcus said, his voice steady, measured. He wasn't challenging her. Not yet. She leaned closer, her arms crossed over her uniform as if bracing for a fight.
You heard me,
she said, her tone loud enough for the passengers nearby to hear.
You people always think you deserve more than everyone else.
A gasp escaped from the row behind him. A woman across the aisle turned, her eyes wide with disbelief. Marcus sat back, his hand gripping the armrest as whispers rippled through the cabin.
"Ma'am,"
Marcus said slowly, his voice calm despite the growing tension.
"I don't think I've asked for anything unreasonable."
Her eyes narrowed, her anger boiling over.
Don't play innocent,
She spat. Then, with a sudden shocking motion, her hand struck his face. The slap echoed through the cabin, silencing every murmur, every movement. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't rise. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his cheek burning but his dignity intact. When he finally spoke, his words were clear, deliberate, and loud enough for everyone to hear.
"This isn't about water.
He said, his voice calm but firm.
This is about respect, and you've just made it clear how little you have."
The cabin froze. Passengers stared, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Marcus slowly turned his head to meet the flight attendant's gaze.
"You don't know who I am,"
He continued, his voice unshaken.
"but trust me, by the end of this flight, you're going to wish you'd acted differently."
The cabin seemed to hold its breath. All eyes were on Marcus, his calm words reverberating through the tense air. Before we delve into this compelling story, let's take a moment to reflect together. Stories like these remind us that beneath every action lies a deeper narrative, a chance for change, understanding, or even redemption. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment that made you stop and question everything? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share your story. And if you're ready for more journeys like this, where real-life lessons meet raw emotion, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Let's explore these moments together, one story at a time. The Boeing 737 of Pacific Air stood firmly on the tarmac at Miami International Airport. Inside, the cabin buzzed with activity as passengers shuffled down the aisle, stowing their bags, adjusting their seats, and exchanging pleasantries. The familiar hum of the aircraft's engines filled the air, blending with the soft chatter of voices and occasional laughter. It was just another routine flight for most on board, a 6-hour journey from Miami to Seattle. Marcus Bennett, a distinguished black businessman in his late 30s, sat quietly by the window in the economy class section. His tailored navy blue suit, polished leather shoes, and sleek watch exuded sophistication, yet he chose to sit among the general passengers rather than in first class. For Marcus, this wasn't about saving money. It was about staying grounded, literally and figuratively. Sometimes, he'd once told his team, you need to walk through the world as it is, not as your wealth makes it. Though he had long grown accustomed to the small irritations of air travel, Marcus carried himself with calm poise, flipping through a magazine he wasn't really reading. His mind wandered to his upcoming meetings in Seattle, and, inevitably, to the memories of his past. As a black man who had risen from humble beginnings to become a billionaire, Marcus had faced his share of subtle biases and outright prejudice. He didn't dwell on it, but it was always there, a shadow lingering on the edges of his success. A few rows away, Amelia Harris, one of the flight attendants, was making her way through the aisle. Her crisp uniform and neatly tied scarf presented an air of professionalism, but her demeanor told a different story. Her smile was thin, her movements abrupt, and her eyes darted with impatience. Amelia was known among her colleagues for being strict and, at times, overly critical. To her, passengers were a source of constant frustration, a job to endure rather than people to serve. As her eyes scanned the rows, they landed briefly on Marcus. Something in his calm yet commanding presence seemed to rub her the wrong way. She looked away quickly, dismissing him in her mind. Probably one of those entitled types, she muttered under her breath. It wasn't the first time her assumptions had coloured her interactions with passengers. though she rarely stopped to reflect on it. The flight took off smoothly, with passengers settling into their seats. Marcus gazed out of the window, the blue skies and white clouds offering a momentary escape from the noise of the cabin. He had hoped for a quiet flight, but fate had other plans. Feeling a bit thirsty, Marcus pressed the call button to request some water. A few moments later, Amelia appeared at his row, her smile barely masking her irritation. "What do you need?" she asked curtly, her tone sharp. Marcus glanced up, unfazed by her demeanour. "May I have a glass of water, please?" he asked politely. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Can't you see I'm busy? Wait until I get to your row," she snapped, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Taken aback but still composed, Marcus replied, "I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just asking." "You'll get it when I say so," she interrupted, spinning on her heel and walking away without another word. Marcus exhaled deeply, leaning back in his seat. A few passengers glanced in his direction, some with sympathetic looks, others with discomfort. But no one said anything. Marcus had seen this before, a quiet complicity that allowed moments of prejudice to pass without challenge. He resolved to let it go, knowing that reacting now would only escalate the situation. Time passed, but the air around Marcus felt heavy. Amelia continued her duties, her interactions with other passengers seemingly more pleasant, though her occasional glances at Marcus betrayed lingering disdain. Marcus's thoughts drifted to his mother's words, spoken to him as a child. "People will try to knock you down, Marcus. They'll judge you before they know you. But how you respond, that's what defines you." He repeated the mantra in his mind, steadying himself, unwilling to let a single person's attitude ruin his day. As the plane climbed higher into the clouds, the cabin's atmosphere grew tense, though the source wasn't immediately clear to everyone. A young girl sitting a few rows ahead of Marcus turned to her mother and whispered, "Why was that lady so mean to him?" Her innocent curiosity brought a faint smile to Marcus's face. Children, he thought, were mirrors of truth pure and unfiltered. Amelia, on the other hand, felt the weight of the tension she had inadvertently created, but chose to mask it with indifference. Each time she passed Marcus's row, her expression hardened, her disdain more apparent. Marcus, however, remained unmoved. His calm demeanour wasn't an act. It was a shield, honed over years of facing challenges far greater than an impatient flight attendant. The cabin settled into a quieter rhythm, but beneath the surface, an unspoken tension simmered. Marcus glanced around, catching snippets of curious gazes from his fellow passengers. Some seemed to wonder why a man of his stature, his aura unmistakably powerful, chose to remain silent in the face of such blatant disrespect. Others seemed indifferent, absorbed in their own worlds. Marcus shifted in his seat, looking out the window once more. The clouds below seemed endless, a reminder of the vastness of the world and the insignificance of moments like these. But he knew, deep down, that this moment would not simply fade away. Something was brewing, a storm he could feel building, though he couldn't yet see its form. For now, Marcus chose patience. But patience, he knew, wasn't infinite. The cabin was calm, with most passengers settling into their routines, headphones in, books open, the occasional hum of quiet conversation. Marcus leaned back in his seat, trying to immerse himself in the book he brought along. But his throat felt dry, the pressurized air in the cabin already sapping his comfort. He decided it was time to ask for that glass of water he'd requested earlier. Pressing the call button again, he waited patiently. Moments later, Amelia appeared, her expression tight, lips pressed into a firm line. "Yes?" she asked curtly, her tone lacking the courtesy that defined her profession. Marcus maintained his calm demeanour. "I'm sorry to trouble you again," he said, his voice steady and polite. "Could I please have that glass of water now?" Amelia's eyes narrowed. She crossed her arms, her irritation evident. "I told you already, didn't I? Wait until I get to your row," she said, her voice sharper than necessary. A few heads nearby turned, sensing the tension brewing. Marcus held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Of course," he replied softly, his tone betraying no hint of frustration. Amelia lingered for a beat longer, as if expecting him to argue, before turning on her heel and walking away. Her steps were clipped, her posture rigid, leaving behind an awkward silence in her wake. The interaction didn't go unnoticed. Across the aisle, an elderly man glanced at Marcus with a sympathetic look, but quickly turned his attention back to his book. A young woman a few rows ahead glanced back, her eyes darting between Marcus and Amelia. But like most people on the plane, she chose not to intervene. Marcus shifted in his seat, gazing out the window again. He could feel the weight of the passengers' eyes, their unspoken curiosity. Yet no one said a word. It wasn't the first time Marcus had experienced something like this, a moment when prejudice lingered just beneath the surface, visible but unspoken. He wasn't angry, not yet. Years of facing moments like these had taught him to temper his reactions, to weigh the consequences of every response. But something about Amelia's demeanour gnawed at him. It wasn't just her tone. It was the way she looked at him, as if he were a burden, an inconvenience. It was the kind of gaze he'd learned to recognise, one that spoke of assumptions and judgments made before a single word was exchanged. A few minutes later, Amelia returned, carrying a plastic cup of water. She placed it on Marcus's tray table with a loud thud, the water sloshing over the edge. "Here," she said flatly, her voice devoid of any warmth. Marcus looked up, his expression calm but his eyes piercing. "Thank you," he said quietly. Amelia didn't respond. She turned and walked away, her shoulders stiff with indignation. The small interaction left an uncomfortable ripple in the cabin. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, but still, no one spoke up. As Marcus sipped the water, he noticed a woman across the aisle watching him. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes and a hesitant expression. Finally, she leaned over. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. Marcus offered her a reassuring smile. "I'm fine, thank you," he replied, though the tension in his voice was hard to miss. The woman nodded, sitting back in her seat. She seemed to wrestle with something for a moment, as if debating whether to say more. But in the end, she remained silent, turning her attention to the window. The air in the cabin felt heavier now, charged with an unspoken tension. It wasn't just Marcus and Amelia who felt it. The entire row seemed to hold their breath, waiting for what might happen next. Amelia's frustration simmered as she worked. Every time she passed Marcus's row, her movements seemed harsher, her demeanour colder. It was as if she couldn't let go of the moment, her irritation bubbling just beneath the surface. For Marcus, it was a familiar pattern. He'd seen it before, the way prejudice could transform small inconveniences into grievances, how resentment could build without cause. He remained composed, refusing to give Amelia the reaction she seemed to be baiting. But even as he maintained his calm, Marcus couldn't ignore the knot forming in his chest. It wasn't just about the water or Amelia's attitude. It was the principle of it, the way her behaviour reflected a deeper issue, one that he'd spent his entire life navigating. Nearby, a young couple whispered to each other, their glances flicking toward Marcus and Amelia. "Did you see the way she spoke to him?" the woman murmured, her tone incredulous. "Yeah, but what can we do?" the man replied, shrugging. "She's the flight attendant. It's her job." "But it's wrong," the woman insisted, her voice low but firm. "He didn't do anything to deserve that." Their conversation was quiet enough that no one else noticed, but Marcus caught snippets of it. He appreciated their concern, even if they didn't act on it. It was more than most people would do. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting slightly. Marcus steadied his glass of water, his thoughts drifting to his mother again. "Patience is strength," she used to tell him. "But never let patience turn into silence. Know when to speak, Marcus. Know when to stand." He exhaled deeply, closing his eyes for a moment. He knew this wasn't over, not yet. Something about Amelia's demeanour told him there was more to come, that this tension wouldn't dissolve on its own. Sure enough, Amelia passed his row again, her eyes flicking to him with a flash of annoyance. This time, she didn't say anything, but her presence felt pointed, deliberate. Marcus met her gaze briefly, then looked away, choosing not to engage. The cabin remained quiet, the hum of the engines the only sound. But the silence was deceptive. Beneath it, a storm was brewing, a confrontation that felt inevitable, like thunder rolling in the distance. Marcus sipped the last of his water, his mind steady but alert. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. This moment, small as it seemed, was about more than just a cup of water. It was about dignity. And dignity, Marcus had learned, was worth fighting for. The cabin of the Pacific Air flight had settled into an uneasy calm. Passengers avoided eye contact with Marcus, though their glances occasionally flickered toward him. The tension was palpable, an invisible thread connecting everyone to the simmering conflict between the dignified man by the window and the flight attendant who seemed to have singled him out. Marcus remained composed, but a storm brewed inside him, a storm he worked hard to contain. Amelia walked down the aisle with a tray of snacks, her steps brisk and her jaw set. She didn't need to look at Marcus to feel the weight of his presence, and it irritated her. She felt exposed, as if his silence was louder than any argument he could have made. To her, his calmness felt like defiance, and that defiance burned at the edges of her patience. As she approached his row, Marcus looked up. His expression wasn't confrontational. It was steady, thoughtful. "Excuse me," he said, his tone measured. "I'd like to ask for a napkin." Amelia froze, her hand tightening around the tray. Something about his voice, too calm, too controlled, ignited a spark of anger in her. "Are you kidding me?" she snapped, her voice louder than it needed to be. The passengers nearby turned their heads, their curiosity now mixed with alarm. "No," Marcus replied evenly. "I'm not." Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "You people always have something to complain about, don't you?" The words cut through the air like a knife. Marcus stiffened, his calm demeanor cracking ever so slightly. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him, their silence amplifying the weight of her words. "What did you just say?" Marcus asked, his voice still calm but tinged with disbelief. "I said," Amelia hissed, her face now inches from his, "you people never know when to stop." The cabin fell silent. Even the soft hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background. The passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort evident. But still, no one intervened. Marcus exhaled slowly, his hands gripping the armrests of his seat. "Amelia," he said, his voice firm but not raised, "I think you're letting your emotions get the best of you." Her face flushed with anger, and she straightened, towering over him. "My emotions?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You've been nothing but trouble since this flight started. You think you're entitled to special treatment? You think you're better than everyone else here?" "I never said that," Marcus replied, his tone steady. "I simply asked for basic courtesy." "Basic courtesy?" Amelia's voice was almost a shout now. "You don't deserve—" Before she could finish, something inside her snapped. In one swift motion, her hand shot out and struck Marcus across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the cabin, sharp and unforgiving. Gasps erupted from the passengers. A woman clapped her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. A child cried out, startled by the sudden violence. For a moment, the entire plane seemed frozen in time, the collective shock palpable. Marcus's head tilted slightly from the force of the slap, but he didn't react immediately. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, willing himself to remain calm. His cheek stung, but the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation that washed over him in waves. He opened his eyes slowly, his gaze locking onto Amelia's. Her hand was still raised, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief at what she had just done. The silence in the cabin was deafening. Every passenger was watching, their faces a canvas of shock, discomfort, and quiet judgment. Marcus sat back in his seat, his composure intact, despite the heat rising in his chest. He refused to give her the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. Instead, he straightened his tie, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You just hit me," he said, his voice low but steady. Amelia's lips parted, but no words came out. She looked around, as if realizing for the first time that she had an audience. The murmurs of the passengers began to swell, a growing tide of disbelief and outrage. Across the aisle, the elderly man who had been watching earlier finally spoke up. "That's enough," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "This is unacceptable." A woman a few rows back chimed in, her voice shaking. "She just assaulted him. Someone needs to do something." Amelia's face turned red, and she took a step back, her tray forgotten in her hand. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but the weight of the passengers' stares rendered her speechless. Her earlier bravado had vanished, replaced by a flicker of panic. Marcus remained seated, his gaze unwavering. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he kept his breathing steady. He glanced around the cabin, meeting the eyes of several passengers. Most of them looked away, their discomfort evident. Others held his gaze, their expressions filled with a mix of sympathy and silent encouragement. Finally, Marcus stood. His towering frame commanded attention, and the murmurs in the cabin quieted. He turned to face Amelia, his expression calm but resolute. "I've faced worse than this," he said, his voice carrying through the cabin. "But I will not let this moment pass without addressing it. What you just did is not only wrong, it's unacceptable." Amelia looked down, her hands trembling. She seemed to shrink under the weight of his words, the reality of her actions finally sinking in. "This isn't just about me," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "It's about every person who's ever been treated as less than, every person who's been judged unfairly because of their skin color or their appearance. Your actions today have consequences, not just for me, but for you and everyone who saw what just happened." The cabin was silent again, the passengers hanging on his every word. Amelia's face crumpled, and she took another step back, tears brimming in her eyes. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered. Marcus turned to the passengers, his gaze sweeping across the rows. "We can't keep letting this happen," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Not here. Not anywhere." The murmurs began again, but this time they were filled with agreement. A man in the back clapped hesitantly, and soon others joined in. The applause grew, a wave of solidarity that filled the cabin with an energy Marcus hadn't expected. Amelia stood frozen, the applause washing over her like a tidal wave. For the first time, she seemed to truly see the man she had wronged, not as a target of her frustration, but as a human being who deserved respect. Marcus returned to his seat, his movements slow and deliberate. He could feel the tension in the air beginning to dissipate, but he knew this was far from over. The damage had been done, and what came next would define not just the rest of this flight, but the story that would inevitably follow. The plane flew on, but for everyone aboard, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. The cabin was eerily silent after Marcus's commanding words. Amelia had retreated to the front of the plane, her posture stiff, and her expression clouded with a mix of shock and shame. The tension hung heavy in the air, a tangible weight pressing down on everyone aboard. Marcus sat in his seat, his hands resting on his knees, his face composed but his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He replayed the slap in his mind, not with anger, but with a sense of disbelief. He had faced countless moments of prejudice in his life, but this was different. This wasn't subtle. It wasn't cloaked in polite words or veiled glances. It was raw, undeniable, and public. Yet even in the midst of this humiliation, Marcus's thoughts weren't on revenge. Instead, they lingered on something unexpected, a flash of recognition he hadn't fully processed until now. As Amelia stormed off earlier, Marcus had caught sight of her wrist. A small tattoo peeked out from beneath the sleeve of her uniform, a delicate design of a dove, its wings spread wide, surrounded by an intricate pattern of olive branches. The image struck a chord deep within him. He had seen it before. It wasn't just a random design. It was identical to the tattoo his trusted employee Rachel Harris had once proudly shown him. Rachel had been more than just a colleague. She was a confidant, a beacon of integrity and kindness. She had shared stories of her family during quiet moments in the office, stories of struggle, resilience, and the fractured relationship she had with her older sister, who had chosen a different path in life. Could Amelia be that sister? The possibility gnawed at Marcus. He leaned back, closing his eyes as the pieces began to fit together. The same surname. The tattoo Rachel described as a symbol of their late mother's wish for peace in the family. The defiance in Amelia's eyes that mirrored Rachel's determination. It couldn't be a coincidence. Marcus opened his eyes and glanced around the cabin. The atmosphere was still tense, passengers whispering in hushed tones, their gazes darting between him and the front of the plane where Amelia had disappeared. He could feel their curiosity, their unease. He knew they were waiting to see what he would do next. But Marcus didn't act impulsively. He was a man of thought, of careful calculation. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself. If Amelia was truly Rachel's sister, this wasn't just a personal affront anymore. It was a tangled web of connections and emotions that needed to be navigated delicately. The hum of the engines filled the silence as Marcus stood, his imposing figure drawing immediate attention. Passengers turned to watch as he moved down the aisle with measured steps, his expression calm but resolute. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of what he was about to uncover pressing on his shoulders. He didn't stop until he reached the galley at the front of the plane, where Amelia was leaning against the counter, her back to him. "Amelia," he said quietly, his voice steady but firm. She froze, her shoulders tensing at the sound of his voice. Slowly she turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed, her expression guarded. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. Marcus's gaze dropped to her wrist. The tattoo was fully visible now, its intricate lines unmistakable. He pointed to it. "That tattoo," he said, his tone soft but insistent. "Where did you get it?" Amelia frowned, instinctively pulling her sleeve down. "Why does it matter?" "It matters," Marcus replied, his eyes locking onto hers. "Because I know someone with the exact same tattoo, someone who told me it's a symbol shared only within her family." Amelia's brow furrowed, confusion and suspicion flickering across her face. "What are you talking about?" she asked cautiously. "Rachel Harris," Marcus said, his voice unwavering. "She works for me. She's one of the most dedicated, compassionate people I've ever met. And she told me about her sister, the one who's a flight attendant, the one she said she hasn't spoken to in years." Amelia's face drained of colour, her breath catching in her throat. She stumbled back a step, her hand gripping the counter behind her for support. You know Rachel," she whispered. "Yes," Marcus said firmly. "And if what I'm guessing is true, that makes you her sister." The cabin seemed to tilt as the weight of his words settled on Amelia. Her mind raced, flashes of Rachel's face, the sister she hadn't seen in so long, invading her thoughts. She remembered their last conversation, the argument that had driven a wedge between them, and the years of silence that followed. Guilt clawed at her chest as she stared at Marcus, unable to form a coherent response. "I don't understand," she finally managed, her voice trembling. "How do you know her?" "She's been part of my team for years," Marcus said. "She spent her time promoting values of inclusion, fighting against the kind of behavior you displayed today. Do you have any idea what she would think of this? What she would feel if she saw what you just did?" Amelia flinched as if his words were a physical blow. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away, her pride battling with her growing shame. "I didn't know," she murmured, shaking her head. "I didn't know it was you. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. "But you assumed, and that assumption led you to treat me like I was less than human. Tell me, Amelia, is that the kind of person you want to be? Is that the kind of sister Rachel would be proud of?" Amelia's breath hitched, and she looked away, unable to meet his piercing gaze. The passengers closest to the galley strained to hear, their curiosity overriding their discretion. The murmurs began again, a low hum of speculation and judgment. Marcus took a step closer, his voice softening but losing none of its intensity. "Amelia, I'm not here to humiliate you, but what you did today goes beyond me. It's a reflection of something much bigger, something that's hurting more people than you realize." Her tears spilled over now, and she wiped at them furiously, her facade crumbling. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said, her voice cracking. I don't know what's wrong with me." "What's wrong," Marcus said gently, "is something you can change, but only if you're willing to face it." The tension in the cabin was electric, the passengers hanging on every word, even as they pretended not to listen. Amelia stood motionless, her breathing shallow as Marcus's words settled into her heart. She thought of Rachel, of the values their mother had instilled in them, and of how far she had strayed from them. Shame coursed through her, but beneath it, a spark of something else. Hope. The possibility of redemption. I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus regarded her for a long moment, then nodded. "The first step," he said, "is acknowledging the problem, and the second is deciding to do something about it." Amelia looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for some sign of forgiveness. "Do you think Rachel will ever forgive me?" she asked hesitantly. "That depends on what you do next," Marcus replied. "But if she's anything like the Rachel I know, she'll want to see you try." The cabin buzzed with nervous energy as Marcus walked back to his seat. Every step felt deliberate, each pair of eyes following him with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Passengers whispered in hushed tones, their words barely audible over the hum of the engines. They had seen the slap, They had heard bits of the heated exchange in the galley, and now they waited for what would come next. Marcus, however, wasn't seeking an audience. He moved with the same calm resolve that had carried him through the confrontation with Amelia, but his mind raced with the implications of what he had just uncovered. If Amelia was truly Rachel's sister, this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Rachel, her values, and the painful disconnect between the two women. As he approached his row, Marcus paused. The tension in the cabin was palpable, the passengers hanging on every movement. He turned, his gaze sweeping over the faces of those who had watched in silence earlier. Then, without hesitation, he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice steady but loud enough to carry through the cabin. "I know most of you saw what happened earlier, and I think it's time we address it." The murmurs ceased instantly. Even the sound of the engines seemed to fade as all eyes fixed on him. Amelia, still standing at the front of the plane, froze. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of defiance and dread. "I didn't ask for this situation," Marcus continued, his voice unwavering. "But now that we're here, I think it's important to talk about what it represents, not just for me, but for everyone." He turned slightly, addressing Amelia directly. "Amelia," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "There's something you need to know about me, and more importantly, about someone we both care about." Amelia blinked, confusion flickering across her face. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel," Marcus said simply. Her breath hitched audibly, and a ripple of surprise moved through the cabin. The name hung in the air like a revelation, its weight amplified by the silence that followed. "Rachel Harris," Marcus continued, his eyes locked on Amelia. "She works for me. She's one of the most dedicated, compassionate people I've ever met. She believes in fairness, inclusion, and treating everyone with respect, values that, frankly, I didn't see from you today." Amelia's eyes widened, and she took a step back, her hand gripping the edge of the galley counter for support. You know Rachel?" she stammered. "I do," Marcus replied, his tone softening slightly. "And I know she's your sister." The collective gasp from the passengers was almost audible. Heads turned, eyes darting between Marcus and Amelia, as the weight of his words settled over the cabin. Amelia looked as though she had been struck. Her lips parted, but no words came out. "You might not realize this, Amelia," Marcus continued, "but Rachel talks about you. She talks about the bond you shared when you were younger, before life pulled you in different directions. She told me about the tattoo on your wrist, the dove, a symbol of your mother's wish for peace in your family." Amelia instinctively touched her wrist, her fingers brushing over the tattoo as tears welled up in her eyes. The once confident flight attendant now seemed small, her defenses crumbling under the weight of Marcus's words. "She loves you, Amelia," Marcus said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "But do you think she'd be proud of what happened today? Do you think she'd stand by the way you treated me? Not as her boss, not as a billionaire, but as a human being?" The silence in the cabin was deafening. Marcus's words had stripped away every pretense, leaving nothing but raw truth. Amelia's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she looked directly at Marcus, her eyes brimming with tears. I didn't mean to," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know it was you. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. "But that's the problem, isn't it? You didn't know, but you assumed. You assumed I was less deserving of respect, less worthy of kindness, because of the color of my skin. And that assumption led you to act in a way that hurt not just me, but everyone watching." Amelia's tears spilled over, and she shook her head, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I don't know why I acted that way." Marcus stepped closer, his tone softening further. "Amelia, this isn't about blame. It's about reflection. It's about recognizing the harm that prejudice, whether intentional or not, can cause. It's about deciding what kind of person you want to be." The cabin remained silent, the passengers captivated by the raw emotion of the moment. Some nodded subtly, their expressions thoughtful. Others watched with wide eyes, as if witnessing a transformation they couldn't yet comprehend. Amelia wiped at her tears, her hands trembling. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "You start by acknowledging the truth," Marcus said, And then you take steps to change. It's not easy, but it's possible. Rachel would tell you the same thing. Amelia looked down, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, a passenger in the back clapped softly. The sound was hesitant, almost unsure, but it grew. Another joined in, then another, until the cabin was filled with applause, not for the confrontation, but for the message. Amelia looked up, her face streaked with tears. Marcus extended a hand, his expression kind but resolute. "It's never too late to start over," he said, "but the choice is yours." Her hand hovered in the air for a moment before she took his, her grip tentative but firm. The cabin erupted into applause once more, the sound echoing through the small space. The tension that had gripped the flight seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of unity and understanding. As Marcus returned to his seat, he felt the eyes of the passengers on him, their expressions a mixture of respect and gratitude. He hadn't just stood up for himself, he had stood up for something bigger, something that resonated with everyone on board. Amelia remained at the front of the plane, her posture still tense but her face softer. She had been humbled, her defences stripped away, and while she didn't have all the answers, she knew one thing for certain. This moment had changed her. Whether she could rise to meet the challenge Marcus had laid before her was a question only time would answer. Amelia stood frozen at the front of the plane, her hands still trembling from the handshake she had just shared with Marcus. The applause that had filled the cabin moments ago began to fade, replaced by a heavy silence that felt louder than the noise itself. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the last hour like a broken record. The slap, the words she had spoken, those sharp, hateful words that now tasted bitter in her memory. Marcus's unwavering composure. And Rachel, her sister. The mention of Rachel's name had cut through Amelia like a blade, slicing through years of denial and anger she had buried deep within herself. She thought of Rachel's face, the way her sister had always looked at the world with hope, even when things were difficult. Rachel had been everything Amelia wasn't, kind, patient, and endlessly forgiving. And now, Rachel's name was tied to the most shameful moment of Amelia's life. Amelia wiped at her cheeks, realizing belatedly that she was crying. She hated crying in public. It felt weak, exposed. But the tears wouldn't stop. She felt raw, her emotions stripped bare in front of an audience of strangers. She glanced at Marcus, who had returned to his seat, sitting with the same unshakable dignity that had defined him throughout the ordeal. She didn't deserve his grace. She didn't deserve his kindness. And yet, he had given it anyway. Marcus sat quietly, gazing out the window as the clouds drifted past. His thoughts were calm now, his anger long gone. He had said what needed to be said, and he could only hope it would make a difference. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "You can't control how others treat you, son, but you can control how you respond, and sometimes that response can change hearts." He glanced back toward Amelia. She looked smaller now, her shoulders hunched, her face pale and streaked with tears. But there was something else in her expression, a flicker of realization, of understanding. It was a start. The passengers were silent, their attention still focused on the two central figures of the drama that had unfolded before them. Some whispered quietly to each other, while others stared out the windows, lost in thought. The air felt different now, lighter yet still charged with emotion. Finally, Amelia took a step forward, her legs unsteady beneath her. She made her way down the aisle, her eyes darting nervously between Marcus and the floor. When she reached his row, she paused, gripping the back of the seat in front of him for support. "Mr. Bennett," she began, her voice trembling. I don't know how to start. Her voice broke, and she took a deep breath, trying again. "I was wrong. About everything. About you. About so many things." Marcus turned to face her, his expression soft but unreadable. He said nothing, allowing her the space to speak. "I've been carrying so much anger," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "At the world, at myself, at Rachel." She blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. "And I let that anger turn me into someone I don't recognize, someone I don't want to be." Her words hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. The passengers watched intently, their earlier judgment softening as they saw the genuine remorse etched on Amelia's face. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. Anger is a heavy burden, Amelia, he said. It clouds judgment. It turns us against the people we should cherish most. But it's not permanent. You can let it go. Amelia's breath hitched, and she nodded slowly. I want to. I don't want to carry it anymore. Then start by looking inward, Marcus said. Ask yourself why you're angry, what's feeding it, and then decide what kind of person you want to be moving forward. She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to her hands. I don't know if I can change, she admitted. I've been this way for so long. What if it's too late? It's never too late, Marcus replied, his tone resolute. I've seen people change, Amelia. I've seen them confront their pasts and rebuild their lives. But it starts with a choice to stop making excuses and start taking responsibility. Amelia looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. You think Rachel would forgive me? She asked softly. Marcus nodded. I do. Rachel is one of the most forgiving people I've ever met. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. She'll want to see you take steps to be better, to live up to the values she believes in. Amelia wiped her eyes, a weak smile flickering across her lips. She always did believe in me, even when I didn't deserve it. And she still does, Marcus said. But you have to believe in yourself too. The cabin was silent, the weight of the conversation resonating deeply with everyone on board. A few passengers exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful. Some nodded subtly, as if agreeing with Marcus's words. Others wiped at their own eyes, moved by the raw honesty of the exchange. Amelia straightened, her posture more confident than before. Thank you, she said, her voice steadier now. For everything, for calling me out, for giving me a chance to be better. Marcus inclined his head. It's up to you now, Amelia. What you do next is what matters. She nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, taking a deep breath, she turned and walked back to the front of the plane. Her steps were slow but purposeful, and for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that she could change. As the plane settled back into its rhythm, Marcus felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't just stood up for himself. He had planted a seed of change in someone who needed it. He hoped it would grow, not just for Amelia's sake, but for Rachel's, and for all the people Amelia would encounter in the future. The tension in the cabin began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of unity that hadn't been there before. The passengers seemed lighter, as if they had been part of something larger than themselves. They had witnessed not just a conflict, but a resolution, a moment of reckoning that reminded them of their own humanity. As the plane cruised through the clouds, Marcus leaned back in his seat, his gaze returning to the window. The sky stretched endlessly before him, a canvas of possibility. Change was never easy, but it was always worth pursuing. And today, on this flight, he had seen the first steps of that change begin to unfold. The cabin settled into a tentative calm after the applause faded, but the emotional intensity lingered in the air like a storm that had just passed. Amelia stood frozen, her shoulders slumped, and her hands trembling as if still holding onto the weight of the shame she had carried for so long. The world around her felt both too quiet and unbearably loud. Her breaths came shallow, each one a fight to steady herself. At her core, Amelia felt as though she had shattered. Everything she had built, her pride, her defences, her justifications, lay in ruins. But amidst the wreckage, she felt something unexpected, a flicker of relief. It was as though Marcus's words had cracked open a window, allowing fresh air into a room that had been suffocating for years. Marcus, still seated, observed her carefully. He had seen transformations like this before, moments when people stood on the precipice of change, uncertain whether to take the leap. He knew that shame alone couldn't drive a person to become better. They had to want it. They had to choose it. He cleared his throat gently, breaking the silence. Amelia, he called again, his voice low but firm. It carried the weight of both authority and compassion. The entire cabin fell silent, their attention drawn back to him, as if he were the eye of the storm. Amelia turned toward him slowly, her tear-streaked face marked with a vulnerability she hadn't shown before. Yes, she croaked, her voice barely audible. I want to say something, Marcus began, standing once more. His tall frame commanded attention, and his calm demeanour only amplified his presence. Not just to you, but to everyone here. He turned slightly, addressing the passengers as much as he was addressing Amelia. We've all been part of something today that goes beyond a simple misunderstanding or an argument. What happened here reflects something deeper, a problem we all know exists, but rarely confront. And while I was the target this time, it could have been anyone. The passengers sat in rapt silence, their faces a mixture of guilt, curiosity, and reflection. Marcus paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "Amelia," he said, turning back to her, "you made a mistake. A big one. But mistakes don't define us. What defines us is how we choose to move forward." Amelia's lower lip quivered, and she nodded slightly. I want to change," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't want to be this person anymore." Marcus took a step closer to her, his gaze unwavering. "Then start by forgiving yourself," he said. "You can't undo what's already happened, but you can decide what happens next." Amelia's tears flowed freely now, but there was a new steadiness in her posture, a small but significant shift. "I don't know if I can make up for what I've done," she admitted. "To you, to Rachel, to everyone." "You don't need to make up for it," Marcus replied gently. "You need to learn from it, to take the anger, the fear, the resentment you've been carrying and turn it into something better. It's not easy, but it's possible." The cabin remained silent, every passenger hanging on Marcus's every word. Some dabbed at their eyes with tissues, while others exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful. Marcus's voice resonated not just with Amelia but with everyone present. His words weren't just about her, they were about all of them. "I'm standing here today because people believed in me," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "Because people gave me a chance, even when I didn't deserve it. And I'm here to do the same for you, Amelia. Not because it's easy, but because it's necessary." Amelia sniffled, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling, "for forgiving me, for giving me a chance." Marcus nodded. "It's not about me, Amelia. It's about you, and it's about Rachel. She loves you more than you realize. If she were here, she'd tell you the same thing. It's never too late to start over." A soft murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. Passengers nodded, their expressions filled with empathy. A middle-aged man in the back raised his voice. "You're a better man than most, sir," he said, his tone filled with respect. "The world needs more people like you." Marcus smiled faintly, acknowledging the comment with a small nod. "The world doesn't need more people like me," he replied. "It needs more understanding, more empathy. And that starts with moments like these." The passengers erupted into applause, louder this time, the sound filling the cabin with warmth. Amelia stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the noise and the emotions swirling within her. But then she smiled, a small, hesitant smile that hinted at hope. As the applause faded, Amelia looked at Marcus one last time. "I'll reach out to Rachel," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I'll tell her everything, and I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "That's a good start," he said. "But remember, Amelia, change isn't about a single moment. It's about what you do every day." She nodded, her shoulders straightening slightly. "I'll remember." As Amelia returned to her station, the cabin began to buzz with quiet conversation. Passengers exchanged stories, reflections, and even smiles. The tension that had once filled the air was gone, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. Near the front of the plane, a young woman leaned over to her companion. "That was incredible," she said softly. "I've never seen anything like it." "Me neither," her companion replied. "But maybe we needed to." Marcus settled back into his seat, his gaze returning to the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting the clouds in hues of gold and crimson. He allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection, thinking of his mother's teachings and Rachel's unwavering kindness. Forgiveness wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Change wasn't guaranteed, but it was always worth striving for. And in that moment, Marcus felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Today had been about more than him. It had been about all of them, about what it meant to be human, to falter, and to rise again. The plane continued its journey, soaring through the clouds toward the horizon, and with it, so did the hope of something better. The plane landed in Seattle just as the last hues of the sunset disappeared beyond the horizon. Passengers disembarked, carrying not just their luggage, but the lingering impact of what they had witnessed during the flight. Marcus waited until most of the cabin had cleared before gathering his belongings, his movements unhurried. Amelia stood near the exit, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She didn't say anything, but as Marcus approached, she offered him a small, trembling nod. "Take care, Amelia," Marcus said softly as he passed her, his voice filled with quiet encouragement. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she watched as he disappeared into the terminal, a sense of profound responsibility settling over her. That night, Amelia sat alone in her small apartment, her phone in her hands. The events of the day replayed endlessly in her mind: the slap, Marcus's calm yet powerful words, and the overwhelming applause from the passengers. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, but also so determined. She had made a decision on that plane, to change, and she knew exactly where to start. With a deep breath, she opened her contact list and found Rachel's name. Her thumb hovered over the call button, hesitation gripping her. It had been years since they'd last spoken, their relationship fractured by arguments and misunderstandings. Amelia had always blamed Rachel for being too idealistic, too willing to see the good in people. Now she realized how wrong she had been. She pressed the button. Rachel answered on the second ring. "Amelia," she said, her voice cautious but warm. "Hi, Rachel," Amelia replied, her voice cracking. It's been a while." "It has," Rachel said gently. "Is everything okay?" "No," Amelia admitted, her tears beginning to flow. "Rachel, I messed up. I messed up so badly." There was a pause on the other end. Then Rachel's voice softened. "What happened?" Amelia took a shaky breath and began to recount everything: the flight, Marcus, the slap, and the realization of who he was. She didn't spare herself, laying bare the full extent of her actions and the shame that had followed. Rachel listened in silence, letting her sister pour out years of pent-up guilt and regret. When Amelia finished, there was a long pause. Amelia braced herself for judgment, for the anger she felt she deserved. But what came next surprised her. "Thank you for telling me," Rachel said softly. "I know that wasn't easy." "I don't deserve your kindness," Amelia whispered. "Not after everything I've done, to you, to him, to everyone." "Amelia," Rachel said, her voice steady, "what matters is that you're ready to change. It's never too late to start. Marcus believes that, and so do I." Amelia broke into sobs, her sister's words washing over her like a balm. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope that their relationship could be repaired. "I want to be better," Amelia said through her tears. "I don't want to be this person anymore." "You're already taking the first step," Rachel replied, "and I'll be here for you, every step of the way." The sisters talked late into the night, the conversation filled with both tears and laughter as they began to bridge the gap that had separated them for so long. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in his hotel room, his laptop open as he reviewed emails from his team. The flight had left him emotionally drained, but also hopeful. He had seen the first sparks of change in Amelia, and he knew the impact of the day's events would ripple far beyond the confines of the plane. A notification popped up on his screen, a news article. Curious, Marcus clicked on it. The headline read, "Billionaire confronts racism on flight, inspires powerful lesson in empathy." Marcus raised an eyebrow as he skimmed the article. It detailed the events of the flight, written by a fellow passenger who had witnessed everything. The writer praised Marcus's composure and his ability to turn a moment of conflict into an opportunity for understanding. The article had already gone viral, with thousands of comments praising Marcus for his actions. Some shared their own stories of facing prejudice, while others expressed how the story had made them reflect on their own biases. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. He hadn't sought attention, but if this story could inspire even one person to reconsider their actions, it would be worth it. In the days that followed, the story continued to gain traction, sparking conversations about racism, empathy, and the power of forgiveness. Marcus received countless messages from people around the world, thanking him for his courage and grace. But what moved him most were the messages from those who admitted their own shortcomings and expressed a desire to change. Amelia, too, felt the ripple effects. The viral story had forced her to confront not only her actions, but also her role in a larger societal problem. She began attending diversity training sessions and volunteering with community organizations focused on inclusion. Each step was a small but meaningful step toward becoming the person she wanted to be. One afternoon, Marcus received a message from Rachel. "Thank you for what you did," it read. "Amelia called me. She's trying, Marcus. For the first time in years, she's really trying. I don't know how to thank you for giving her that chance." Marcus stared at the message for a moment before replying. "She gave herself the chance, Rachel. I just reminded her it was there." As the weeks passed, the story of Marcus and Amelia became more than just a viral moment. It became a catalyst for deeper conversations about accountability, redemption, and the importance of seeing each other's humanity. For Marcus, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about carrying forward the lessons his mother had taught him, the lessons he had lived by his entire life. And for Amelia, it was about proving to herself, to Rachel, and to the world that change was possible, even for someone like her. The journey wasn't over. It never was. But for the first time, they were all moving forward, together. The video of the confrontation had been uploaded mere hours after the plane landed, and it spread across social media like wildfire. Captured by a passenger seated a few rows back, the clip showed Marcus's calm yet powerful words as he addressed Amelia, the applause that followed, and the quiet dignity he carried throughout the ordeal. The internet was quick to react. "A lesson in grace," one post read, accompanied by a clip of Marcus forgiving Amelia. Another captioned, "How one man turned prejudice into progress." Comment sections were flooded with discussions, some praising Marcus for his composure, others reflecting on their own experiences with bias. "This is what leadership looks like," one user wrote. "If more people approached situations like this, the world would be a better place," another added. Amid the praise, there were those who criticized Amelia harshly. "She should lose her job," one comment read. "No forgiveness for this kind of behavior." But many, inspired by Marcus's example, pushed back. "The whole point is that people can change," one user replied. "She admitted her mistakes and is trying to do better. That's what matters." Amelia had avoided the internet in the days following the incident, overwhelmed by the knowledge that her actions were now on display for the world to see. But when she finally mustered the courage to watch the video, she was struck by two things: the rawness of her own behavior and the unshakable grace with which Marcus had responded. She read through the comments cautiously, her heart sinking at the harsh words, but lifting at the supportive ones. "You can do better," one comment said. "Use this as a turning point." Another read, "Apologizing isn't enough. Prove that you've learned." And so, Amelia made a decision. She wasn't going to hide from this. She was going to act. Her first step was reaching out to Rachel. With her sister's help, Amelia connected with a local community organization that focused on racial equity and inclusion. It was the kind of work Rachel had been involved in for years, but Amelia had never thought to join her. Now, she wanted to make up for lost time. Her initial meetings with the group were daunting. She felt out of place, unsure of how to contribute. But she listened. She absorbed the stories of those who had faced prejudice and worked tirelessly to combat it. She asked questions, seeking to understand perspectives she had ignored for so long. In the weeks that followed, Amelia began volunteering regularly. She helped organize workshops, assisted with community events, and even participated in a panel discussion about personal accountability and growth. It wasn't easy. Every step felt like walking uphill, but for the first time, she felt like she was moving in the right direction. Meanwhile, Marcus's life continued at its usual pace, though the events of the flight had left an undeniable mark. The viral story had thrust him into the spotlight, and while he appreciated the praise, he was more focused on the conversations it had sparked. In interviews and public appearances, Marcus spoke about the incident not as a singular moment, but as part of a broader dialogue about empathy and change. "What happened on that plane wasn't just about me," he said during a live Q&A. "It was about how we, as a society, handle conflict and how we see each other. Everyone deserves a chance to grow. Forgiveness doesn't excuse the past, but it paves the way for a better future." His words resonated with audiences, inspiring discussions in boardrooms, classrooms, and community centres. Schools began using the video as part of their curriculum on inclusion. Companies invited Marcus to speak about leadership and handling adversity. The story became more than just a viral moment. It became a movement. Amelia and Marcus didn't speak again immediately after the flight, but they kept track of each other's journeys from a distance. Marcus heard from Rachel that Amelia was making strides in her community work, and he felt a quiet sense of pride. Amelia, in turn, followed Marcus's speeches and interviews, drawing inspiration from his words as she navigated her own path. One day, Amelia decided to reach out. She sent Marcus an email, unsure if he would respond. In it, she wrote, "Dear Marcus, I wanted to thank you again for everything you said to me that day. Your words changed my life, not just in how I see others, but in how I see myself. I've started working with a community organization, and I'm trying to live up to the values you and Rachel believe in. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm committed to this path. Thank you for believing I could be better. Sincerely, Amelia Harris." Marcus replied the same day. "Amelia, I'm glad to hear from you. Change is never easy, but it sounds like you're taking the right steps. Remember, it's a journey, not a destination. Keep going. Best, Marcus Bennett." In the months that followed, the impact of the story continued to grow. Marcus launched a new initiative through his company, focused on funding grassroots organizations that promoted diversity and inclusion. He worked closely with Rachel, whose ideas and insights became integral to the program's success. Amelia, meanwhile, became a visible advocate for accountability and growth. She spoke openly about her mistakes, using her story to encourage others to confront their own biases. Her vulnerability resonated with people, and while some remained skeptical, many found her willingness to change inspiring. 1 year after the flight, Marcus, Rachel, and Amelia stood together at a community event hosted by Rachel's organization. The three of them shared the stage, speaking about their intertwined journeys and the lessons they had learned. The audience, a diverse crowd of community leaders and activists, listened intently, their faces reflecting hope and determination. As Amelia finished her speech, the crowd erupted into applause. She looked at Marcus and Rachel, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged, not because she was perfect, but because she was trying. And that, as Marcus had said, was what mattered most. Months had passed since the flight that changed everything. Yet, the ripples from that day continued to spread, touching the lives of people far beyond the plane's cabin. For Amelia, the journey was ongoing. She was no longer the woman she had been before, quick to judge, quick to anger. Her days were now filled with meaningful work, from organizing workshops to participating in diversity panels. But the biggest change wasn't external. It was the way she viewed the world and herself. Amelia often thought of Rachel and Marcus. She held their words close, especially during moments of doubt. Whenever she felt the weight of her past creeping back, she reminded herself that change wasn't about erasing mistakes, but building a better future on their foundation. It wasn't easy, but with every step she took, she felt lighter, freer. Marcus, too, reflected on that day, though he didn't dwell on it. For him, it wasn't about reliving the confrontation or the forgiveness he had offered. It was about what came after. He had witnessed the potential for change in Amelia, and that gave him hope for others. Through his company's new initiatives, Marcus worked tirelessly to create opportunities for underrepresented voices to thrive. But more than that, he became a symbol, not just of success, but of grace. His story resonated with people because it reminded them that strength wasn't about power. It was about empathy. It was about standing tall without tearing others down. The audience that had followed the story continued to carry its lessons. For some, it was a wake-up call, forcing them to confront their own biases. For others, it was a source of inspiration, proof that even the smallest moments of accountability could spark transformation. The viral video of Marcus and Amelia had become a staple in schools and workplaces, used to teach empathy, forgiveness, and the importance of self-reflection. It wasn't just a story about a billionaire and a flight attendant. It was about all of us, about the choices we make every day and the courage it takes to change. As for Marcus and Amelia, their paths crossed again from time to time. They weren't friends in the traditional sense, but there was a quiet understanding between them, a recognition of the role they had played in each other's lives. At one such meeting, Amelia told Marcus, "I used to think change was impossible, that people were who they were, and that was it. But you showed me something different. You gave me the chance to prove myself wrong." Marcus had smiled, his voice steady as he replied, "You gave yourself that chance, Amelia. I just reminded you it was there." The story didn't end with them, though. It continued to unfold in the lives of everyone who heard it, who shared it, who used it as a mirror to examine their own actions and beliefs. Some people changed, others didn't. But the lesson remained, the power to be better, to forgive, to grow. It was always there, waiting to be claimed. As Marcus once said during a speech, "The world won't change overnight, and it won't change all at once. But it will change, one person at a time. And that's enough. That's always enough." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and crimson. It was a reminder that every ending held the promise of a new beginning. And for Marcus, Amelia, and everyone their story had touched, this was only the start. In the end, this story is a reminder of what truly matters: our shared humanity. Marcus's grace and Amelia's courage to change show us that dignity, love, and understanding can bridge even the deepest divides. We are all part of this world, connected by the choices we make and the kindness we show. Equality isn't just an ideal, it's a journey, one that begins with each of us choosing to see others not for their differences, but for their shared humanity. Let this story inspire you to forgive, to grow, and to lead with love. Together, we can create a world where respect and compassion are not exceptions, but the rule. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and open the mind. Until next time, remember, every story has the power to make a difference, yours included.